Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about my favorite books that I read while I was on a 2-year hiatus from BookTube. So the last BookTube video that I made before my 12 months reading vlog was at the end of 2023. And over 2024 and 2025, I read a lot of great books that I didn't necessarily get to talk about with other people. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to review some of the best things that I read during that time, just in case you're curious, or maybe there's something that you might want to pop onto your reading list. Obviously, moving forward, I am going to be making a lot of videos about what I'm reading now and those kinds of things, but I thought it would be nice to take a little step back and just look at a couple of the books that had a big impact on me. This is not going to be a top 10 because I think I am actually going to make a top 10 video about all of my top 10s from 2020 to 2025, because that's something that I just sketched out in my reading journal at the end of 2025. And I thought it was interesting to look at the trends, the kinds of books that made it there. And I think it would be fun to even go back and maybe tier rank them and see if they have remained all-time favorite books or if they've kind of gotten lost or forgotten over the years, and how your favorites in the moment kind of stack up over time, what kind of longevity those books have. But for today, I'm going to be talking about my 6 favorite books that I read during my BookTube hiatus. And just because adult fantasy is kind of the main theme of the BookTube channel at large, I thought that I would start off with the adult fantasy novel that made the cut. And that book is technically a duology, and that is the Sarantine Mosaic by Guy Gavriel Kay. This is a little bit of an unfair pick because I actually did participate in some discussions for this book, but I did read it during that time, and so I felt like it was appropriate to put on the list. I never got to make a review about it. I didn't get to talk about it as much as I wanted to, and so I really wanted to put it on this list because it is one of my favorite adult fantasy books that I have ever read. Not just favorite book from the last couple of years, favorite adult fantasy novel ever. And I know this is a bold claim, but I personally think that it is one of the best adult fantasy novels that has ever been written. I'm saying novel because even though this is a duology, the ending of the first book, Sailing to Sarantine, and the beginning of the second book, Lord of Emperors, just bleed right into each other. I feel like this is a duology in terms of, publishing necessities, not necessarily narrative structure. So I picture them in my mind as one big book, even though it is technically a duology. But for anybody who has never heard of it, the Sarantine Mosaic is a fantasy duology by Guy Gavriel Kay that is based on the Byzantine Empire. Guy Gavriel Kay does this a lot. He takes real historical figures, time periods, cultures, and brings them into and creates his own fantasy novel based on those spaces. If you are somebody who knows a lot about this point in history, there may be some plot points or maybe some character arcs that feel familiar to you. This is not a point in history that I knew a lot about, so there was nothing that gave any hints to me, and I thought it was all very exciting and extremely well thought out. Why do I think this duology works so well? I think it combines some of what are Guy Gavriel Kay's greatest strengths. So I would say if you have never read anything by him, his prose, his characterization, the way that he integrates artistry and poetry and human experience and human culture, and the way that art intertwines with and matters greatly to our lives, how he pulls all that into a fantasy novel gives him some of the richest settings and the richest characters, in my opinion. And all that is in fine form in the Sarantine Mosaic. But we also combine that with some really exciting plot-driven action. I haven't read a ton by Guy Gavriel Kay, so there are certainly booktubers who know far more about his works than I do, who have a lot more experience. But from the books that I have read, I do think that in general, you will probably like Guy Gavriel Kay if you are okay with a slower paced fantasy novel. If you are okay with events unfurling slowly, with a big build-up, you're looking into a lot of character motivation, you're looking at how people change over time, there are often many influences on a character. And then this is all true for the Sarantine Mosaic, but there are also some incredibly intense moments. There is a race in this book that is one of the most stressful experiences that I've had reading a fantasy novel, one of the most exciting passages that I have ever read in a fantasy novel. It takes a bunch of really cool historical elements and makes them into a book that is very difficult to put down. I still think about these books all the time. I still think about the main character all the time. This book made me cry, and not because of any character deaths. People die. I mean, this is a big book with a really big cast of characters, and there are people who die. However, just moments of humanity came through and really brought out so many emotions in me as I was reading this. There are passages, there are sentences, there are events that happen that make you reflect on what it means to be a human and to create and to care about something. And you think about legacy and immortality, and there's so many complex themes, questions, scenarios that come to life in this book, and I absolutely cannot recommend it highly enough. I would love to do a longer video where I talk about the historical influences, the poetry that influenced Guy Gabriel Kay, but that's gonna be all too long for a video of this size. So this may not be the last time that I talk about Sailing to Sarantine or the Sarantine Mosaic, but I just want you, the main takeaway that I wanted to get out of this is that it was the best fantasy novel that I have read in the last couple of years, and I think that everybody should read it. Will it be for everybody? No, nothing is. However, I think that there is a great chance that you could really like it, and if you have not read it yet, then I cannot recommend it highly enough. The second book that I wanted to talk about, just to kind of, well, I guess we're not really switching gears altogether, but it's a very different kind of book, is one of my favorite books from 2025. And this one I actually have in my house, and that is Devotions by Mary Oliver. So this is a selection of poems by Mary Oliver. Most people, I think, probably know Mary Oliver from her poem, The Summer Day, which is the last line of the poem goes something like, what is it that you want to do with your one beautiful life? What is the end of that one? I'm going to find it because I don't want to butcher it, but I'm sure that you have seen it. It is, you see it on artwork, you see it online all the time. People talk about it. Summer Day, 3:16. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So that's the poem that I think most people know by Mary Oliver, but this is a selection of her poetry taken from all of her different poetic anthologies. So it is taken from all of the books that she published throughout her career, and there were many. She was very prolific. So it starts at 1963, so some of her very old poems, and goes up to her collection Felicity in 2015. And even if you are not a poetry person, because I think that's true for a lot of readers of fiction, sometimes poetry feels too inaccessible, it feels too abstract, it feels too different from what we are used to reading. And I will say that when I went to university, poetry was something that I did not like to read at all. And it wasn't until I took some classes with professors who helped me understand the process of reading poetry and helped me come to terms with the fact that I could not rationalize everything that I read, and I might not necessarily understand everything that I read. And it was important to feel things instead of just knowing things, that I even started to like poetry. That being said, I think that Mary Oliver's poetry is very accessible for anyone. Even if you are not a poetry person, I think that there are things that you could find in her poetry that resonate with you. Her verse is not incredibly complex. They are straightforward. The ideas behind them are very straightforward, but they are beautiful. She writes mostly about nature and what the natural world means to her. There is a lot of overlap between her idea of spirituality and what that means and what she believes in, and how that intersects with nature and what nature should mean to us and what it does mean to us and what it can give to us. So many of her poems are named after birds, they're named after environments, ecosystems, places, and a lot of it has to do with that sense of the holy that many people get from nature. And I just think that her poems are beautiful. I really, really enjoyed reading this. It was one of my favorite things, as I said, that I read last year. And I certainly found a bunch of poems in here that I have gone back to read, that I've doodled in my reading journal. I think that there's so much that we could learn from her. I think that she had a very admirable approach to life and how to interact with the world. And that is something that I would like to better emulate moving forward. So again, this was a great selection. Even if you're not a poetry person, I think it might be nice to have this. Read a couple poems, you know, take it out, read one or two, put it away, take it out when you need something slow or small, you don't have a lot of time. But again, could not recommend this highly enough. So definitely loved that. The next book that I want to talk about is a series once more. So this is not a singular book, but I did begin reading Berserk over the last couple of years. So Berserk has been really big in some spheres of BookTube because it is a hugely popular and influential manga. Before I picked up Berserk, I had been given so many warnings about Berserk. So the one thing that you will see when you start to read, or if you ever start to read Berserk, is that there will be no shortage of people looking at you and saying, are you sure? Are you sure that you want to go through with this? It's going to be a journey. And that is true. That being said, I feel like I was warned about Berserk and what reading Berserk might do to me, or how it might make me feel, or what I might be exposed to, that when I read it, it was not as bad as I was expecting, only because it had been built up to be something that was going to traumatize me for life. It is a dark story. Berserk follows the main character, Guts, who is a mercenary, and he has a very difficult life. From his conception to his birth, all throughout his life, he goes through any number of traumatic events. His relationships are very complicated. The world that he lives in is very dark. There's very little happiness for Guts overall, and there are some incredibly dark things that happen in this series. However, I think if all you ever hear about for Berserk are the warnings, that you'll miss out on a lot of really rich storytelling, a lot of gorgeous artwork, and a really complex and satisfying story. I am not finished with Berserk. I am at volume 11 of the deluxe versions, and I don't know how many of those there are. I think there might be 14 or 15, and then there are some volumes of Berserk that haven't been put into one of those large volumes yet. So I am a significant portion of the way through, definitely more than halfway, but I have not finished it. And I have read enough to know that this will be one of my favorite stories of all time. It is hugely influential in the realm of dark fantasy, whether you're talking about manga or whether you're talking about movies or comic books or novels. I just think that Berserk has been a hugely influential work for a lot of people. Berserk itself it gets touted as a dark fantasy, but it's a mashup. You have classic fantasy tropes. I feel like there are definitely influences from shoujo romance in here. There's a character in the book that has to be based on, at least influenced by, a character from a very popular shoujo manga / anime. It reads sometimes like a toxic BL. There's a lot of really toxic character dynamics that are very intense. They take bromance to like level, 1,000. It's just, there's a lot. There's a lot of stuff that's going on. But I think the only thing that you ever hear about it is how dark it is. And it absolutely is. But that takes away from all of the other things that it is. Am I okay with everything that happens in Berserk? No. Were there some parts of Berserk, not the parts that people warned me about, but other parts that I just found genuinely creepy, and not in a fantasy way? I don't feel like the author and I would really get along in our opinions about this particular thing kind of way. However, I do think that it is a gorgeously illustrated and brilliantly written series. There is a lot to talk about for Berserk as well, and I'm debating whether or not I'm going to do some reviews. I do find the history of what influenced Berserk, especially in terms of fantasy, because I did see a lot of elements, plot points, things that are explored in Berserk that had to have dark fantasy roots. For example, I'm sure that the author must have been influenced by Elric of Melniboné. There are overlaps between the things that happen in Elric and the things that happen in Berserk, that it had to be one of the influences. I'm sure the sword and sorcery, fantasy novels at large, Conan, those kinds of novels must have been an influence. There are lots of really cool things that you see where you can see the influences that must have come into Berserk. There are lots of really cool things in Berserk where you see things that must have influenced modern day fantasy authors or people who write comic books or, you know, any of that kind of dark fantasy genre. So there's a lot to explore in Berserk. It is very complex. It gives you a lot of food for thought. It gives you a lot to discuss. I'm not sure how comfortable I feel reviewing anime or manga on the channel, just because that is a wide audience that I do not currently reach, and I'm not sure if I want to, but I also think that it's really fun to talk about, so we'll see where I land on that. For the time being, I will just say that Berserk is one of my favorite things that I have read over the last 2 years, and I'm excited to catch up, but then it'll also be kind of sad because I'll be caught up and then I'll be waiting for things, which is never fun. But Berserk, absolutely glad that I finally picked this up and having a really good time with it. Next, we have a work of literary fiction that is on the list, and that is My Brilliant Friend. So this is the first book in the Neapolitan novels, or the Neapolitan Quartet, which is a literary / historical fiction series that is set in 1950s Italy. I think specifically in Naples in the 1950s. And a lot of people really love this. This is a favorite, all-time favorite for a lot of literary fiction lovers, and I have definitely joined the ranks. I'm super excited to continue on with the rest of this series. I went into it knowing that there was a lot of hype, and sometimes that can be a tough thing, that it can be hard to live up to that kind of reputation, but this was definitely a book that appealed to me. I loved the characterization. It mostly focuses on the very intense, sometimes toxic, sometimes sustaining friendship of two young girls who are growing up in Naples in the 1950s. And these are extremely flawed characters. There are points of the novel where you will want to shake them. You will want to scream in frustration. They make dumb decisions. They make decisions that you won't agree with. They think things that are untrue. There's miscommunication. There's jealousy. There's support. There's love. There's all kinds of things. And I thought that it was brilliantly done. I really enjoyed the writing. I loved the characters, even though I didn't always like the characters. I loved the characters, and it really made me want to read more. I am definitely not the first person to really love this series. It was made into also a very successful television show. I'm sure lots of people have heard about it. I'm not going to talk about it, for any longer, only to say that I fall on the side of people who really love this novel, and I want to continue the series and hope that I will just continue to enjoy the books more and more as we go on. I have one work of nonfiction that made it to this list as well, and that is the book Snakehead by Patrick Radden Keefe. I've talked about other books by Patrick Radden Keefe on the BookTube channel before, and I believe, I will have to double check, but I think that I have read all of his long form published narrative / investigative nonfiction. Patrick Radden Keefe, I think, is my favorite writer of narrative nonfiction. He is an investigative journalist. He wrote, oh gosh, the name is completely escaping me, Empire of Pain, the book about the opiate crisis, specifically in the United States. He wrote, I'm going to forget all the names, Say Nothing, which is about the IRA, the conflict in Ireland. He's written tons, but the book that I read while I was away from BookTube was Snakehead. And that's one of his earlier books. So this one was written in 2009, and it focuses on illegal immigration and the illegal immigration of Chinese immigrants to America in, I think, the 80s and 90s. I think mostly that's where that centers. And it's really interesting. It's a really funny story. So I originally bought this on audio. And when I was listening to it, I thought, this is really short. I remember because I also had done Empire of Pain on audio, and I feel like that was, 10, 12 hours, something reasonably, something that seems standard for a work of nonfiction. And then I picked up Snakehead, and I feel like it was 2.5 hours or 3 hours long. And I thought, that's really odd, but I guess I'll read it. And it wasn't until I was almost finished that I noticed that I had purchased an abridged version of the book. And I liked it so much that I wanted to know what the whole thing was about. And so then I got the second audiobook, which was the full version, and re-listened to it immediately after the first one. So not only did I like this book, I liked it enough to listen to it twice in a row. And I think that the additions were helpful. So if I can remember correctly, the book, as many of Patrick Radden Keefe's books do, they usually center around one specific event. And the event in this book was the running adrift of the Golden Venture, which was a transport cargo ship that ran adrift, I think, or ran aground in, I think, New York. and it was transporting undocumented or illegal immigrants into the country. And this one event then kind of sets the stage for the main character of the book, which is Sister Ping. And she is one of these snakeheads, or one of the leaders of the groups of people who were living in America who would help. And I use the term help very loosely because people really wanted to get to America, and the conditions and the requirements for them to do so were brutally dehumanizing and would often make their lives incredibly difficult for a long time. And they wanted so badly to come to have a better life, to create a better life for themselves, for their families, to be able to support their families. And it really is heartbreaking to read everything that they had gone through. But it centers around Sister Ping, who was one of the leaders of this movement. And so we get the event of the Golden Venture, and then it kind of spans and explores Sister Ping's life and how she came to be in America and what she did and who she worked with and how many people she brought in. And it's very fascinating. The full version of the book talks a little bit more at length, talks a little bit more about immigration and rules in America and policies and how cultural shifts and beliefs shaped those policies and things that were supremely fair and unfair and how that impacted real people. And it was fascinating. I think that it taught me a lot, number one. And it was interesting to read about. And it was also heartbreaking. It was really sad, as many of his books have been. But I did read some reviews online saying, you know, oh, I've read Empire of Pain and I read Say Nothing, and I don't like, this one wasn't as good. I really enjoyed it. I do personally think that Empire of Pain is probably the best. But people get better at their craft the longer they write and the longer they publish and the more that they do. So that makes sense. But I thought this was phenomenal. I would highly recommend it. I think that all of his books are great. I would recommend any of them if you look them up and there's one that looks interesting to you. There hasn't been a single one that I have not enjoyed. But The Snakehead was good enough for me to read or listen to twice in a row. So I don't know what more of a recommendation I could make other than that. And the very last book that I wanted to talk about is not a novel at all. Actually, it is a novella. I think it's a novella, not a short story. This one I read on my Kindle, so I can't visualize how big it was or how many pages it was, but I think it's a novella. And it's called Princess Floralinda and the 40-Flight Tower, which is a mouthful, but it's a novella by Tamsin Muir, who is the author of Gideon the Ninth. And if you are not new to the channel and you remember when I was making BookTube videos, you will remember that I am a huge Loch Tomb fan. I loved Gideon the Ninth. I love the Loch Tomb. I love Tamsin Muir's writing. So we are going into this recommendation knowing that I am 100% biased. The way that Tamsin Muir writes, her irreverence, her wit, the way that she subverts tropes, which can be expectedly unexpected. She's doing things that are unexpected in the genre, but I feel like fit her usual style. So I didn't read this book and come away completely shocked by everything that had happened, but there were fun subversions of tropes because that's what she's really good at. So I highly, highly enjoyed this reading experience as well. This is one of the last books that I read in 2025, actually, because I was running really behind on my Goodreads goal and I needed some short things to read. And this is one of the ones that I picked, and I'm really happy that I did. The basic setup is that you have Princess Floralinda, who is captured by a witch, and she is placed in a tower. And on all 40 flights of that tower are a variety of beasts that princes are intended to come and defeat in order to rescue her. So she lives at the top, and she has an ever-fulfilling, an ever-sustaining collection of food. I think it's milk, and I don't remember what she's eating, bread and milk or something, but it regenerates itself over and over. So she doesn't get hungry. She's up there. She is alive, but she's lonely and bored. And in the beginning, princes come, but none of them get past the first floor. Her life kind of changes when a fairy crashes into her room, a fairy named Cobweb, and we start to see Princess Floralinda's personality take root, not necessarily in good ways. She does some very morally dubious things in this book. She becomes increasingly desperate and increasingly strong, but also increasingly willing to do what she needs to do instead of what she is expected to do. So there is a fun change in her behavior, and I think it's really interesting to see. The relationship between Floralinda and Cobweb is twisty and complex and interesting to read about, and I just thought this was delightful. It is, if you are looking for something short to fill in your TBR and you like fairy tales, you like subversions of fairy tales, you like a kind of sarcastic and witty fantasy novel, could not recommend it highly enough. I've said that about every single book on this list, but that's why they're on this list, because I can't recommend any of them highly enough. But that's it. That is my collection of 6 books that I read and really enjoyed over the course of my time away from BookTube. I will be back, as I said, to talk about my top 10 novels that I read from 2020 to 2025, and then obviously to talk about the things that I am reading right now. But I appreciate all of you being here, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!